Hello, my name is Acharya Susan Chapman, and I'm here with Greg Heffron, who is the owner and manager of the Green Zone Institute and has been partnering with me for many, many years in teaching these teachings on the 5 keys to mindful communication. So we're going to introduce each other, and then we're going to proceed with offering you an experiential class in how to work with the principles in the 5 keys. Would you like to begin?
Yeah, I'd like to start out by warmly introducing Acharya Susan Chapman, author and Buddhist teacher. She began exploring mindfulness meditation in the early 70s and attended graduate school at Naropa University in contemplative psychology in the 1980s. She's been working on this material that we'll be presenting today since the late 80s and has presented it around the world in many dozens of workshops and to many hundreds of participants like yourself. So very glad to be here today working with my mentor and colleague and friend, Susan Chapman.
Thank you, Greg. And likewise, Greg has an extensive history of mindfulness meditation. He's a meditation instructor and a teacher. And one of the things that really drew me to his expertise when we began working together was his passion for a communication training called Mudra Space Awareness, which was presented and developed by our teacher, Shogam Trungpa Rinpoche. And he's taught at the Juilliard School and worked extensively with the Mudra Space Awareness, as well as in the last many years has worked with me on developing these workshops. He is a master of fine arts, and he's really delightful to work with. So I think you'll notice that we get along well. So I think I'll take the lead in this class by introducing, wanted to say some general things about the approach to mindful communication that I've taken in the book, The 5 Keys to Mindful Communication, because it's a model and a set of teachings that have many levels, many dimensions to them. And so there's a few core principles that are very important. And I wanted to begin by introducing the importance of what I call a green zone. So what Greg and I are providing right now is a green zone. The notion of a green zone is that in order to actually experience any kind of authentic communication, we need to step out of the speed and the habitual patterns of our daily life and create some kind of space, some kind of opportunity to deeply listen. So you could say in general there are 2 kinds of green zones. One is the space that we create to deeply listen to ourselves. And the second is the space we create to deeply listen to another person. And it's this deep listening, or this listening from the heart, that creates an environment for something fresh and something authentic to arise. So there's a little bit of discipline involved in creating a green zone, both the one for ourselves and the one for each other. And that's because there's so much momentum in speed and distraction and the habit of not listening that's actually become normalized. So in order to clarify that, we'll say that there's a red zone and a green zone. The red zone is the habit of kind of not giving ourselves enough time to actually know how to listen to ourselves as well as to each other. And so the green zone is constructed in a deliberate way, and yet it's also not it's not a rigid structure. It's a structure based on gentle guidelines. And of course, the first guideline is that we have to create that space. We have to set aside quality time one of the principles in the book is that there's no communication we can have with another person that isn't affected by the degree of communication we have with ourselves. So, in other words, in order to have good communication, authentic communication, there's a whole opportunity to learn how to listen to how does our own being express itself? How do we know how to listen to ourselves? And so that's the importance and the role of meditation, self-reflection, contemplation. Those are the practices that we do in a personal green zone. So before we go on to talk about and demonstrate how to work with another person in conversation, I thought the good place to begin would be with exploring how do we do this? What is this meditation? What is this listening skill for learning how to listen to ourselves? How do we know what we know? How do we receive information right here, right now, in present time reality? So that's the starting point. And in order to navigate this relationship with ourselves, in the book I introduced the 3 lights, the traffic lights, but actually I'm going to right now just talk about 2 lights, the green light and the red light. And originally in the book, when I'm describing those lights, they're actually meant to be like navigational lights. Not too many of us have done this, but if you happen to be in a boat and you're navigating through a narrow channel, that navigation will be a series of lights. The light will turn red when you're in the dangerous shoals, and that's a reminder to steer clear of something that will get you into trouble. And then the light will be green when it says go ahead. So these 2 lights are meant to navigate, just help us find that balance of what it means to be present in a way that we can learn how to relax and listen to ourselves. Again, we'll use these lights when we talk about communication with others, but to start with, let's use these 2 lights as a way of navigating a relationship with ourselves. So I said at the beginning, we all come from a habit of the red zone being normalized. And so that means that the red light feels normal to us, and we tend to forget what our green light, what our normal or healthy way of listening feels like. So the practice of meditation is meant to restore that balance. That's the whole point of meditation. It's a practice. Of course, the word meditation is used in a lot of different ways, but right now we're talking about a simple mindfulness meditation for how to listen to ourselves. So as an example, I'd like to demonstrate 3 stages or 3 faculties of how we communicate with ourselves. And in the book, I call this the natural communication system. We don't have to learn this. Every human being is born with this capacity, but we do need to relearn it when we've become normalized in the red light, in the red zone. So what we're relearning is how to connect to that inborn intelligence that communicates with the present moment. So we begin with our body. And so in meditation, the first thing we're taught is to discover a posture that's wakeful. And when you discover this posture, you'll find this is the same posture that allows us to listen attentively to another person. It's the posture of wakefulness. It means that within our body, there is a posture of being asleep, or a posture of tension, a posture of being closed. And then there's another posture of being open. And we find that posture by navigating with feedback. The body gives us feedback when it's open, and it gives us feedback when it's closed. So the feedback when the body is closed is tension. And the feedback when the body is open is a certain kind of alignment that might be unfamiliar at first, but it's an upright spine. It's the body finding the alignment that allows us to breathe and relax and be present in our body. So that's an example of using the tension and the relaxation as a way of navigating to find this balanced position within our body. And when we're in our body, we can then listen and allow the body to connect us to the environment around us. A very interesting principle about mindful communication is that when we're completely in the present moment, we're open. And when we're open, the environment and ourselves are not divided. So when we find this alignment of our body, at that moment, there's an openness to the environment around us. For this reason, there's another way that we talk about the wakefulness of our body, and that is our sense perceptions. So when we're open, our sense perceptions are fresh, and they're continually communicating to us information about the present moment. So for instance, I have these beautiful flowers, and one way that I can very quickly come back to kind of a meditative state, especially if I'm at work, for instance, is to turn to the flower or to rest my attention on the flower and notice that when I first look at the flower, I'm not paying attention. I'm just going, oh, there's the flowers. But as I relax, I can actually make a relationship with the flowers so that the color and the freshness and the shape of the flowers is as if it's something I've never seen before. And that's one of the qualities of being in the present moment, is that there is a synchronization between the body and the mind so that the information that's arising is fresh. It's not something that is part of the preconceived idea. It's something new. So when we look at a flower, there might be a moment of seeing it the way a young child looks at it, something you've never seen before. It's beautiful. There's something fascinating. And so all of our sense perceptions are like that. Our sense perceptions can be distracted or closed when we're not really paying attention, or the sense perceptions can open and give us new information. That's an important way of navigating using the wakefulness of our body. And it also tells us a lot about the openness of our mind, because the freshness that we're talking about means that being present and listening deeply to our present moment experience has a lot to do with letting go of our preconceived ideas and allowing new information to arise. What that means is that the present moment is giving us feedback, accurate feedback. It's giving us a reality check. And we're either listening to that information or we're not. So this is how the awake body, the sense perceptions, and the openness of our mind function together. And in meditation, we do that by bringing our body into a posture of wakefulness. In our tradition, we leave our eyes open. We have a gaze. Often we lower the gaze in order to kind of relax. We kind of rest our attention in the field of the sense perceptions. We don't have to follow everything, but we just allow the field of sound and the field of sight to simply rest there. But what we do is when we notice our thoughts and the stories and the narratives in our mind carrying us away, which is the red light, when our storylines, we jump on the train of thought and that train takes us somewhere into the past, into the future, When we notice that, then we come back to the present moment. And the way we do that, often it could be through a sense perception, coming back to the flower, or it could be coming back to the breath, which is the one we use most often. But we use some method to let go of the thought and come back. So again, we could ask the question, what is it? What is this inborn intelligence that recognizes that we're distracted? You know, if we didn't have some kind of inborn intelligence that recognizes when we're not paying attention, then we would never come back. So the fact that our thoughts carry us away, again, it's not good or bad, it's just what happens. Then out of nowhere comes a flash of the green light that says, oh, I'm thinking. And it brings us back to the present moment. So the discipline for working with this is called go with the green light. It means that whenever there's a flash of present moment wakefulness, we have the commitment to ourselves that we're going to come back. We're not going to go along with those trains of thought. So again, we have a wakefulness of the body that has its own intelligence, its own wisdom. It's a natural communication faculty. And we also have the openness of our mind, the curiosity, the wonder, the capacity to recognize when we are distracted and to come back. And that's what we call open mind. And the third function of our inborn communication system is the tenderness of our heart. And what we mean by that is that we're not talking about the conventional idea of emotions. We're talking about something more fundamental, that there's a natural capacity that we all have to experience joy. For instance, when you see beauty, there's a joy in recognizing beauty. It's not just a neutral sense perception. There's joy. And there's also the capacity to feel fear, to feel alarm, to feel a range of emotions. All of them are attuned to the present moment. And that's what we call the tender heart. It's a green light capacity to respond to the present moment with a quality of affection or quality of relationship. In other words, we're vulnerably responsive to what goes on. When we're not paying attention, when we're distracted, this tender-hearted capacity morphs into all kinds of emotional reactions that relate to the stories of the past and the future. And those can tend to be very destructive. So we will talk as we go along, especially in relationships with each other, about the important difference between the tender heart and the secondary reactive red light patterns that are the basic energy of tenderness that gets wrapped into negative or defensive storylines. So coming back to this kind of system, in our meditation, we're learning to use this inborn capacity of awake body, tender heart, and open mind as the method for finding out, how do I know what I know here and now? What does it mean to be open? And we become more and more familiar with that openness. So when we talk about when the light is green, go, which is the first principle of a green zone, this is what we mean. We train by creating a little bit of time every day, quality time, to be with ourselves. And that quality time is shaped by a little bit of discipline for the sitting meditation, the mindfulness meditation, and then some self-reflection, taking a teaching such as this teaching or some kind of inspiring information that you're working with, and reflecting on it, taking out a journal, writing out your own thoughts so you can learn how your own words and your own ideas surface. It takes a warm and accepting and compassionate listening environment for our own inner voice to surface. And so allowing ourselves the opportunity to be creative, either writing or dancing or painting, some form of creative activity is really a valuable part of our green zone. So with this as a very basic kind of discipline, and recognizing that what we're doing is building our communication skills, always starting with ourselves. This is a very, very helpful and important way of regarding communication in general. So let's just take a very short example. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I want to, again, guide us through this practice of creating our own personal green zone. So begin by making a commitment to finding some time during the day when you can do this, even if it means stepping out of the office and walking down to the park and sitting on the park bench for 10 minutes. Finding some agreement, and it's like a new friendship. You're committing yourself to this date. And then when you get to that time and that place in your schedule, begin by attuning ourselves to being in our body. Maybe taking a deep breath and allowing the body to show us what wakefulness feels like. Beginning with allowing our posture to find its wakefulness. It's upright, not rigid, relaxed but strong. And just feel what it feels like to be embodied as a human being right now, present moment. Noticing that when we're sitting here, we're in an environment that is communicating to us through sense perceptions. There are sounds, there are sights, there are tastes, there are smells. We can feel our body. And all of those sense perceptions are, you could say, the companion of the present moment. Those sense perceptions can either be blocked by our concepts and our habits and our speed, or we can open to those sense perceptions and just allow them to speak to us. When we do, we don't grab onto any sound, any sense perception, we just simply allow it to be there. Then notice that our mind sort of operates with thinking and feeling, thinking and emotions, stories continuously arising in our mind. This is how to listen to our mind. We are being a good listener, and our mind is like a friend who's beginning to open up to us. And yet we're very much in a habit of following every train of thought. So now we have what we call positive interruptions. And that is that even though the stories running through our mind are very captivating, very familiar, our intention is to actually interrupt that train and come back to the present moment. Because what we want to be able to see is how the mind plays without being glued to past and future. What does the present moment look like when it comes to our thoughts? So notice how the thoughts carry us away, but come back to the green light. Interrupt, rest, open. Usually using your breath or some object to come back is very helpful. So the present moment needs some kind of marker because we're so in the habit of being distracted. So even if you put a little stone in front of you, that's your marker. I'm coming back. The intention is not to stare at the little rock, it's to use the rock as a reminder to come back. But generally your breath is easier because it's always with us. Notice how thoughts carry me away and how I come back. This is a very important skill for learning to listen to other people. And finally, let's touch in on this feeling of tender heart, that there's a lot of emotions that we carry with us throughout the day. So many emotions, so much, some of them very painful, some of them triggering a lot of anxiety. But in the background, there's just simply this tender vulnerability of what it means to be human right now. So just coming back to a sense of welcoming this vulnerable, tender heart and allowing that to show us what it feels like to be human right now. So right now I might be feeling just a background sense of loneliness, or there might be a little touch of sadness. It might be like watercolors mixing in a jar of water, but different colors that don't really have a solid statement, that they're just simply blending. And that's exactly what it feels like. It's just vulnerability, tenderness, and a childlike naivety about allowing ourselves to be touched by whatever's going on right now. So again, this is a brief introduction to a method for how to listen to ourselves. It is foundational. We can't truly be authentic with another person if we can't be authentic with ourselves. So I'd like to pause now and engage in a little dialogue with Greg. Just ask for his comments and see if there's anything he'd like to add to this description of awake body, tender heart, and open mind.
Sure, I really appreciated the image of the watercolor paints blending and that sense that things aren't one thing or another. They're mixing and they're active, and there's a sense of movement and play, and that there's no final answer, but it's a living process. What our tenderness is, there's no answer. There's just the process that we observe and are mindful of. Yeah. And I also I thought maybe I would ask something. When we were talking about thoughts, the idea that thoughts take us away. Is there? Of course, the question arises: is there room for thinking with meditation and things like that? Just wondered what you might say about that.
Thank you. There's so many misunderstandings out there about the word meditation, and certainly a lot of people think that the opposite of thinking too much is not thinking at all. And I think most of us are afraid of our mind. At least I know I was when I first started meditating. It's like when I started to meditate, my mind felt like it was getting crazier, that there were so many thoughts and it felt out of control. And at least ignorance felt like bliss because it felt like I didn't, I was less aware of how confused I was. But if we think of it this way, that, when it comes to communication, there's basically two things happening. There's listening and there's speaking. And of course, we're talking about the body speaks to us in nonverbal ways, and the heart speaks to us in this kind of poignant, vulnerable way that has no words. But the place where the words come from is the thoughts. And so if we had no thoughts, we would have no words. We would have no communication at all. So it's not a case at all of trying to get rid of thoughts. It's a case of learning how to allow thoughts to relax. Because just like the body has tension or relaxation. And the mind has tension and relaxation. But what most of us don't realize is that the tension of the mind expresses itself in thoughts, chain reaction thoughts, fixated thoughts, preconceived ideas that we cling to, a whole set of thoughts that we call toxic certainty, which are expressions of ignorance. They're thoughts that serve as platforms for not having a look at the present moment, thoughts that refuse feedback, refuse to let go for new information. So, when we're working with meditation, we're actually opening a whole playground. And in that playground, we're beginning to navigate between the red and the green. What are the thoughts, ideas, and words and conversations that lead to harm? Like any good playground, we want to have some rules about what's safe for the kids. And what are the thoughts, ideas, emotions that lead to further openness and relationship and connectedness? So while we're not suppressing, but we are also learning how to navigate.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
That question, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
So the process of having a green zone for ourselves personally, as I said, even if it means taking 10 minutes a day just to sit on a park bench or to take a little time tuning into ourselves, it's foundational for our relationships. All of us want to be more authentic in our relationships. That's where we're nurtured. That's where we discover this kind of bond with other people, which is mutually nourishing. And this is something we all long for in our lives. So how do we accomplish that? The first thing is that we don't necessarily limit the idea of relationship to a single person or to an intimate circle. We can regard every conversation that we have, even with a stranger, as being a relationship. So that's one of the principles of this model, is that every conversation is a relationship, and there's no such thing as a conversation that has no value. So we're constantly receiving opportunities to reconnect to the present moment through communication. So now we'll shift our attention from the personal green zone into conversation and communication with others. And in order to do that, let's go back to the red light and the green light and talk about the very basic question: what does it feel like when I'm closed? What does it feel like when I'm open? So all of us intuitively know the answer to those questions. And what we're inviting you to do is to actually bring forward that question and explore it. So what does it feel like when communication closes with another person? Even a stranger. If a stranger on the street makes a negative or critical comment, there is an impression that makes on us. You could say it's like an emotional bruise. We human beings are wired for relationship. It's our nature. It's part of who we are. We're born with an instinct to bond, to connect, to have this kind of heart bridge that is the place where information exchanges with other people. Again, because many of us have been, trapped, you could say, in a lifestyle that's very speedy and distracted. Often we have forgotten what this heart bridge feels like. We know we long for it, we don't know how to get back to it. So again, we're going to use these green and red lights as a navigational system, asking the question, what does it feel like when communication is open? And what does it feel like when communication closes down? The guideline for a green zone is when the light is green, go. When the light is red, stop. Stop does not mean suppress. Stop simply means recognize communication has closed, pause, and drop into the feelings of usually feelings of sadness, feelings of hurt, whatever feelings arise as a result of communication breakdown, drop into those feelings. And what will happen is some form of compassion arises when we acknowledge that pain. So communication, working with the red light is really working with compassion, the pain of communication breakdown, which is a very important principle because, number one, most of us don't recognize when communication breaks down, so we keep going into the danger zone. And number two, when communication breaks down, it's the very real kind of grief that people feel. There's a loss, and there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding that occurs in that gap. That's where we introduce the third light, which is the yellow light. The yellow light is the in-between feeling, in between being open and closed. And it's here that we explore the fear, the doubt, the anxiety that surfaces when something unexpected happens, particularly when communication breaks down and there's this feeling of, what did I do wrong? What's wrong with me? And it's not a solid experience. It's different from being in the red zone. In the red zone, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. That's really a shutdown. But in the yellow light, we're not shut down yet, but we're also kind of scrambling, wondering what happened. And it's a time when self-doubt tends to arise. So that's why we look at these three lights and three guidelines. So again, in our mindful communication training, we don't have any rules, but we have three guidelines. When the light is green, go. Learn how to recognize openness. How does it feel? And when it happens, we go toward it. It's a positive interruption. That positive interruption can happen from our body, coming back to a sense perception. I noticed that when I said that, there was a flush on your cheeks. I wonder, how did you hear what I just said? I notice you're coming back to your sense perceptions. It could be coming back to tender heart. I suddenly had a feeling that I might have hurt you. There's a sudden empathy or the arising, something is coming in through the vulnerable feelings of your heart. It could be an interruption that comes from awake, open mind. The recognition that I was holding on to a strong opinion and suddenly I realized I was wrong. Now that you tell me that, I realize that I was wrong, and I really appreciate that feedback from you. So those are ways that the green light operates through positive interruptions that bring us back to the wisdom of the present moment through awake body, sense perceptions, present moment embodiment, through a vulnerable empathic connection to the other person, or through the ability of the mind to interrupt its own certainty, fixation. So that's what we mean by go when the light is green. Then again, we have the guideline when the light is red, stop. Again, in any interaction, there are lots of moments where the lights are, you could say, switching off and on. We're not able to pay attention all the time. If I just said something very important to my friend and my friend wasn't able to hear it, it's not a blame situation. It just means that the light was red. And therefore, I need to acknowledge communication is down. This is not the best time for me to be trying to share the most important information. So, for instance, when my husband is driving, he tells me this is not the best time for me to be talking because he can't drive and listen at the same time. So if I keep trying to talk when the light is red, then it could lead to frustration or misunderstanding. But the third guideline is when the light is yellow, take care. That means that we have to learn to recognize these in-between periods in our communication and make a commitment to ourselves and each other to protect the vulnerable feelings that arise during that time, help ourselves recognize what's going on, but at the same time, we're going to interrupt any confused understanding or misunderstanding with a positive interruption back to the present moment. So I could say, for instance, that I'm feeling very hurt, that my husband couldn't hear me, but it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me or that there's something wrong with him. So if I have a green zone partner, that partner will listen through my yellow light experience and help me come back to a reality check of the present moment. So that's how the three guidelines operate in communication.
Can I just add something quickly here? That in our classes and courses that we teach, we emphasize that the simplicity of these three guidelines that Susan has put together for us is crucial. They can sound oversimplistic, but in fact their simplicity is their strength. That these three phrases: when the light is red, stop; when the light is green, go; when the light is yellow, be careful, are helpful because when we're upset, when we're in emotional chaos, when we feel emotionally bruised, as Susan mentioned, which just happens, it's just part of our experience. It's not there's no blame there either. It just happens. But very simple guidelines are helpful. It's a little thread that we can follow that takes us back towards a more sane, a more heartful, a more reasonable approach to our experience in that moment. So instead of feeling like it's too childlike to have these simple phrases, we could actually appreciate that there are times in our experience when we ourselves are a little bit childlike, and be glad that we have simple instructions to follow with that.
So I want to make a distinction between the red light and between ordinary pain and discomfort. So when we talk about the red light, when we talk about what happens in relationships, it's almost as though there's a wounding. But, in our everyday life, we have ups and downs. We have events that inspire us and events that hurt us, and we have everyday suffering. We have loss. People we love die or get hurt. We ourselves get sick. There's a lot of events that occur in relationship that are, unavoidable. Let's say unavoidable suffering. And we also have the beauty of relationship, which is learning to expand our horizon to include information and feedback and diversity that normally isn't within our realm. So one of the basic principles of mindful communication is that simply by being interrupted, in the sense that every time we come back to the present moment, engage in a conversation with another person, we're learning something fresh and new. And in order to learn that, we have to be able to let go of something that is outdated. It's like updating our computer programs. And so I wanted to use a simple example to describe something that, again, is quite profound. But this is talking a little bit more about the difference between ordinary green light ups and downs versus the red light. So in our ordinary life, for instance, I've already talked about the beauty and joy of the flowers. And in a relationship, you could say the flower symbolizes falling in love. Here's another human being. You listen to them, you appreciate them, there's affection that arises for them. Human beings easily form bonds. We're naturally attuned to affection with each other. It doesn't take long. When you pay attention to someone, listen to their story, a bond of affection arises. But one of the problems is that we can fixate on that and try and make it last. And that's where the joy of connecting with another can turn into a red light habit of trying to freeze them and make them always be like that. It's like me wishing that these flowers would never die. So having some recognition that the things that we love are constantly changing, that the flowers are dying and turning into compost, letting go. There's a fluidity that we have to accept. And that fluidity comes from continually allowing our experience to bring in something fresh and new. So I have, as an example, I brought my compost bucket. So I have here my compost bucket and the flowers. Compost bucket is the part of my experience that is uncomfortable and I'd rather not know about it. It kind of stinks. It's not fresh and beautiful like the flowers. It represents the destination of the flowers, that they're going to end up in here. And on a more poignant level, it's like every birth leads to a death. In my life, I would like to have just flowers, but in fact, compost is always part of it. Part of the view of mindful communication, which comes from the teachings of contemplative psychology, is that, you could see that there's compost in every flower and there's flower in every compost. The sense that there's a full cycle. Every conversation has a moment where you really bond to the person and another moment where you let that relationship go and it falls back into a kind of a aloneness again. And so we allow the balance. This is a very important point, that we have a balance between the freshness and joy of the connection and then the, you could say, the stinkiness of the compost. And they're not equal. We can't say that they're equal. We're not going to sit down and put a bucket of compost on our dining room table. We're not going to eat it. There's a natural intelligence to being open, but that intelligence has this paradoxical wisdom of recognizing that you can't hold on to things. And also that through the process of composting comes new life again. So that profound view is blocked when we have a fixed idea or a toxic certainty that things should always feel good and that endings of things are bad. And so we call this, in the communication work, we call this mindless heart, is the habit of trying to ignore the fact that things end and trying to make them last. And there's all kinds of strategies in relationship through communication that we do. In mindless heart, we give away our intelligence in exchange for the imagined security of things lasting. And that causes all kinds of problems in our relationships. Likewise, there's another pattern called heartless mind, where we take the things we don't like in our life, the stinky compost, and we turn that into some kind of blame, some kind of rejection, some kind of finding fault, making that some kind of punishable error, instead of accepting that that's part of the whole process. So within our communication system, within the red light, we recognize these two patterns. The pattern that leads to craving and, you could say, denial, and the pattern that leads to aggression and rejection. And the point here is that both of those patterns are unnecessary and destructive and can be remedied by learning how to stop with the red light instead of going along with red light patterns. So these arise in communication, in conversation. So for instance, with Greg and I, maybe we could enact a very simple example of how these lights work. So for instance, Greg and I are co-workers, and we've been getting along really well, and I'm new in the workplace, and he's my best friend. And so
I've got my lights too.
Oh, you've got your lights too? Okay, great. And so I have formed this helpful connection. I feel open when I'm with Greg. And then I'm saying to Greg, I hope we're having lunch together today. And he very honestly says,
yeah, I've got other stuff going on. So, oops.
So that's my yellow light. So what I expected to have happen was I expected that we would have lunch together, and instead I'm feeling hurt. And not only am I hurt, I feel disconnected from him. So right now, it feels like he disappeared and I've been turned into an object. And just like a little child who's separated from a parent, I'm starting to scramble. Like, what went wrong? What did I say? What did I do? He's not who I thought he was. He must have gotten to know me and discovered that there's something wrong with me. I knew it was true. I didn't fit in here. So there's a lot of fears and self-doubts that arise in that moment. So one of the principles we use is the difference between I and thou, which is this idea of being connected to the green light, and then I and it, which means that Greg has now turned me into an object, or at least I feel that way. And that's extremely painful, because whenever we're turned into an object, it's one of the hardest things a human being can handle. And we've gotten used to it, but we don't want to get used to it. We want to actually explore that vulnerable feeling. Yeah, so what has happened now is I'm in the yellow light, and this is an important time for us to talk about the meaning of the yellow light. The yellow light is, again, it's a background anxiety that surfaces whenever we get thrown off. In fact, even if you're stumbling on the sidewalk, as I did one time, I fell down while I was crossing the road. And in that moment of falling, there's all these, like, what's happening? And I've had two occasions where I stumbled on the sidewalk. One, I was crossing the sidewalk, and this guy who was driving this big black pickup truck immediately jumped out of the truck to come out and help me and ask me if I was okay. And so I had what I call a restorative experience. Like, on the spot, my feelings of being embarrassed and vulnerable and hurt were surrounded by his kindness, and it allowed me to restore some sense of balance to myself. And so that would be an example of how the yellow light can turn back to green. But we do have these episodes of stumbling in our relationships, in our conversations. But given the right environment, and the environment is one of acceptance, allowing vulnerability to be okay, and surrounding that pain with kindness, that enables the yellow light to turn green again. On the other hand, the second time that I fell on the sidewalk, I was in a foreign city, in a foreign country, and people looked at me like there was something wrong. Probably like what happens to a lot of people who are homeless or who are addicted or have were differently manifesting than the crowd. And these people looked down at me, and I was on the sidewalk, and I felt really humiliated, and I didn't have that restorative experience. And in that case, for the rest of the day, I kept having this feeling of shame, of self-doubt, of I don't belong here. In other words, the yellow light led to the red, and I started to shut down. So this again is the importance of the yellow light. We have a process which we'll talk about another time about that we call restorative dialogue. But in short, it's the way that we can help each other restore confidence in our goodness and restore trust in relationship when we're in that yellow light of feeling hurt, vulnerable, embarrassed, ashamed. All of these emotions we associate with this in-between feeling. And the interesting thing is, like, if I had a very traumatic experience as a child, as a younger person, or any time in my life, let's say I had somebody in my life who was very critical of me, then I might be very susceptible to feeling an inner kind of self-criticism. And, the red light in some ways shapes this false sense of who we are, this feeling that there's something wrong with us. It's shaped by other people's red lights. So a lot of what we do is try to recognize that when someone's light turns red, when communication breaks down, it's not about who we are. It's just simply communication breakdown. And we have to realize that these are old traumas that surface. So therefore, there is this possibility of doing some deep healing work with each other by showing each other how to bring compassion and trust to those moments when this part of ourself surfaces that we've been hiding, this fear that there's something wrong with us.
Can I just say that's so important, Susan, what you're talking about right now, and I think many of us identify with that feeling. I know we can't cover everything in this short class, but what would be the takeaway instruction of what to do in that vulnerable yellow state?
Yeah, well, I think with all the three lights, the first instruction is to recognize them. So the takeaway with the yellow light is to recognize that behind our reactions to each other, there is this vulnerable, almost like a child part of ourselves that's feeling hurt and feeling afraid and having some kind of doubt. And that is a very uncomfortable place. Most of us want to get out of that place as soon as we can. So it's counterintuitive for us to be encouraged to stay in that place. But if we learn how to stay in that place and allow the vulnerability to be protected, especially if we can do that for each other, then something much deeper can happen, which is we can actually investigate the fact that these self-doubts have no basis. They're not coming from a real place. They're simply thoughts. They're simply feelings. So the takeaway is really learn how to trust vulnerability in general. And until we have the strength to comfort and support ourselves, have one person in our life who we can process with when that's happening. And that person would be continuing to bring the attention back to ourselves rather than trying to pin the blame on someone outside of ourselves or support the storyline. A lot of the stories that run through our mind are in fact false news or fake news, because we have a lot of misunderstandings. And the core one is there's something wrong with me, and of course related to that is there's something wrong with you. Which, by the way, if I want to get out of the yellow light, the most common pattern is to take my fear and project it onto you. So, this is if we have a graphic, which we could add the graphic of the seesaw. that I make you bad so that I can feel okay. Or you make me bad at your expense. So whether we call it being unworthy or unlovable or unforgivable, it's like we're riding a seesaw. So the way out of the yellow light is to make the other person feel what we're feeling. And that's called projection.
So the blame goes back and forth, the fingers get pointed back and forth. And
yeah.
We end up with a very divided situation.
So maybe we could close the class with a very simple exercise that is kind of a way of bringing compassion to this part of ourselves that surfaces when the light is yellow. And that's a practice I call extend and embrace. So what you do is when you can begin to identify the part of yourself that gets triggered, maybe a feeling of being unworthy, or I've got to be perfect because my mistakes are unforgivable, or some little part of ourselves that has been in hiding that we've been rejecting. And this is the part that surfaces when we're humiliated or embarrassed. Then put that part as if it was a child, a lost child, even a refugee or an orphan child, in front of us. And with our eyes closed, imagining ourselves as the green light kind of unconditionally accepting parent. On the out breath, we extend our arms and connect with this child. And on the in breath, we bring that child and embrace into our heart. We do that 3 times. So we extend out and connect with that part of ourselves. The part that it's like a hot potato, the part we always want to toss onto someone else. And we bring that back into our heart, owning our own projections, accepting the part of ourselves we've been afraid of. 3rd time, we reach out, make a connection, and then we bring that part back in, owning it, embracing it, loving it, accepting it. And if you do that 3 times, you're doing it kind of on the rhythm of the breath. What we've been able to do is establish enough time for the neural pathways in our brain to develop some new roots. So we're including a physical gesture, we're including a visualization, and we're creating a scenario that supports the insight that the parts of ourselves that we don't like will end up being projected on other people. And therefore, one of the best ways that we can restore health and trust and healing in our relationships is to restore this health and trust and healing within ourselves. So that kind of brings us full circle that we start with ourselves and we conclude with ourselves. But in the process, the journey of mindful communication is very much about relationship. Without relationship, we would never be able to learn. We would never be able to see through our blind spots. We would never get irritated enough to develop patience and kindness and compassion. So we need every relationship in our life, whether it's with the janitor in our building or the bus driver, or our most intimate friend. And all of these relationships manifest in the form of conversations. So this is why communication is like one of the biggest practices that we have. We're communicating with the present moment at all times, whether we're aware of it or not. And are we listening to the present moment, or are we ignoring it? Are we listening to the people we're with, or are we ignoring them? Are we listening to our own beings, or are we ignoring? So the journey towards becoming authentically who we are is the journey that comes right back to awake body, tender heart, open mind, and most importantly, this heart bridge with each other.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. I really appreciate this material today.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, and look forward to further classes where we can maybe hear more from you.
Yeah, and I want to say that to the audience that this is just the tip of the iceberg of this material. You know, there's so much more to say about the pattern of mindless heart and heartless mind. Didn't really touch on the 5 keys to mindful communication. So we have courses in various locations, and you can find out our schedule at greenzonetalk.com. And further, we have a rotating 5-week online course available at Shambhala Online. And enjoyed this material today. You can look up the schedule for that and see when the next course will start. So,
Great.
thank you all.
Okay,
so much.
thank you for joining us. Hope to see you again.